Have you ever felt forced to listen to somebody else's trauma? In this video, I'm going to be talking about the phenomenon that occurs when that happens and how it relates to spiritual abuse. My name is Dr. Felicia, and I'm a licensed psychologist, and I focus on the treatment of spiritual abuse and OCD in my practice. So, back to the question at hand. Have you ever been in that type of situation where you felt literally forced to listen to somebody else's traumatic experience? If you've ever been there, you've been on the receiving end of what is known as trauma dumping. Now, what is trauma dumping? It sounds pretty much, exactly the way it's phrased. When you are experiencing trauma dumping, you are in a situation where somebody is telling you traumatic experiences about themselves, and you didn't provide any consent to listen to it. And I'm going to talk about what that means because it can be confused with some other concepts. So, friends share deep and meaningful experiences with each other, and they also can share things that have caused them trauma in the past. However, what I'm talking about is in a situation where you don't know somebody or you don't know them very well, and they just start to share all these very difficult and painful experiences with you. And people who I have worked with professionally have talked about how this has happened to them in spiritually abusive environments. And so I want you to, as I'm talking about this in this video, I want you to take some time to understand how to look out for this and why this occurs. And so if you ever, I want you to think about a time where that has happened to you. And I want you to look back and ask yourself, how did that feel in the moment? I can imagine it might have felt very awkward. If a stranger is sharing with you very personal and very traumatic experiences, or maybe somebody that you don't know, it can feel awkward, but it can also feel very heavy. And it can also feel very intrusive. In that situation, you didn't say that it was okay for them to share that with you. And so you can feel just kind of, you can feel very heavy in that situation, but not only heavy, you can feel like that your needs weren't taken into consideration. Now, I can imagine somebody listening to this and saying, well, shouldn't we be there for people? And isn't it okay for strangers to share things? And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm sure we've all been experiences where maybe we've consoled a stranger, or we ourselves were having a bad day and a stranger listened to us. That's not the same thing as trauma dumping. When somebody experiences trauma, it is a very, obviously, very painful experience, but there also is, it's deeply personal. And so, when you're in a place of emotional health, you choose wisely who you share your trauma with. People typically share trauma with close friends, and then when they have like a therapist, they're probably going to share more of that trauma with that therapist as the time builds and as they develop a good trusting relationship. So those are appropriate ways of sharing trauma. However, if you are on the receiving end of someone sharing really deep traumatic experiences with you, you can even feel violated. You didn't sign up to listen to that, and it can be really challenging. In spiritually abusive environments, this occurs more often than you would think. And I have a video that talks about how vulnerability is weaponized in spiritually abusive environments. So I'll put that link in the description box and you can go ahead and listen to that because this will give you more context for this video. When you are in a situation where somebody is trauma dumping on you, regardless of whether you realize it or not, there's this sort of sense of responsibility that comes up on your part because somebody is sharing something that's very intimate, that's very deep, very personal, and very painful. And so that puts a burden on you to be a caretaker for that person. And that might not be something that you signed up for. And in spiritually abusive environments, people use this to try and create a sense of a false sense of intimacy. So I'll go back and tell you, I'll go back in time and tell you an experience that somebody told me about that they experienced in their own spiritually abusive environment. And they said that they were in kind of like a big circle, right? Their group was sharing things, but the things that everybody was sharing were very deep and very personal. And this person was a newcomer and they didn't really know anybody in the group. And so it felt very awkward to them, and they felt pressure to share very deep and personal and traumatic experiences as well. And apparently this was the norm for that group. That's pretty much what they did all the time. And this person didn't like it. They felt very uncomfortable. And so when they declined to share, everybody in the group kind of looked at them funny, and they were sort of accused of not really being very transparent or very vulnerable. So if you think about that kind of situation where spiritual abuse is going on, somebody can use that way of trauma dumping to get the person who's listening to it to feel all sorts of things. They can feel they can feel a sense of obligation to that person. There's also a false sense of intimacy that can occur when people trauma dump on other people, right? If somebody is telling you something that's very deep and very personal, you've kind of bypassed a lot of the initial stages of friendship and relationship. And if you fast forward it all the way to what would happen much later in a friendship. And so it feels very rushed and it feels fake. And when this occurs in spiritually abusive environments, those people who are being trauma dumped on are can be rather objects of control. If you think about it, if someone has heard if you have heard all these like really intimate and difficult things from somebody else, you have, regardless of whether you realize it or not, a sense of obligation toward that person, and that can be used to control and to manipulate. Another thing that happens when trauma dumping occurs is that the person who is on the receiving end of it may feel like they are beholden to that person. So they have to take care of them if they're upset. They just feel a sense of obligation that is not real. And so when you are in a spiritually abusive environment, I want you to take care to make sure that you're not on the receiving end of this type of behavior. Sometimes you might have been the one that's trauma dumped. I know that I've talked to, people who have said that they felt in the situation, there was a lot of pressure for them to share something traumatic and they later regretted it. And so it's important that when you are in these types of environments to value your privacy, to value even what you want to hear and what you don't want to hear. If you think about what it can be like to be on the receiving end of trauma dumping, you might have your own difficult experiences that you have not had a chance to process. And that can just open the box all over again. So people report feeling very drained, feeling sad, feeling panicky, feeling like they are not in control because something was dumped on them without their consent. And so it's important not only to be aware of this, but to have proper boundaries in place so that you're not on the receiving end of it. And then also to realize, what is the function of this? When people are doing these things in types of in groups and it's not appropriate, it can create this false dynamic that everybody's close and now we have to do all these things that maybe you did not sign up for. And so I hope that helped. If you would like any other information about spiritual abuse, go to my website, skillsetcounseling.com, and you can also book a free consultation there. So I'd love to hear from you in the comment section. Have you ever been on the receiving end of trauma dumping, or have you ever felt pressure to do that yourself? If you have, drop that in the comment section and also let people know how they can manage these situations themselves. All right, I hope you have a wonderful day that's filled with peace. Bye-bye.